Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Emma Ashford. I'm a senior fellow in the New American Engagement Initiative, a part of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security here at the Atlantic Council. This event today is part of NAEI's Future Foreign Policy series, which seeks to elevate new, diverse perspectives on US foreign policy and builds on the Scowcroft Center's core mission, which is to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and the world. Today, we're honored to be joined by Representative Joaquin Castro of Texas to discuss China and the role of diplomacy and public engagement in US foreign policy. Representative Castro has been at the forefront of these issues, speaking widely about State Department reform, the importance of diversity and diplomacy, and most recently in proposing a bill that would create an open translation and analysis center to translate important documents from China, Russia, and other countries into English for public consumption. The conversation today will be moderated by John Hudson, a national security reporter at the Washington Post and a well-known voice on US foreign policy issues. We'll also have time at the end of our session for some audience Q&A. So if you have questions, please drop those into the Q&A function on Zoom and we'll get to them at the end. John, take it away.
Well, thanks a lot for that, Emma. Congressman, I'm excited to talk to you today about China and US foreign policy, especially on the heels of this new legislation that you have introduced on bringing sort of, as far as I understand it, a translation service on open source documents and news stories coming out of China, government documents coming out of China. As I understand it, this idea is inspired by the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, which provided translation and analysis of Soviet bloc and other foreign government media during the Cold War. Given the roots of this legislation and the sort of Cold War inspiration, do you think that that's really what we're in right now? Basically a new Cold War with China?
No, I don't think that we are. I don't think that it's the same thing as what we had with the Soviet Union. And in fact, I don't think it can be the same thing for everyone's sake. But there's still a usefulness for this open translation and analysis center for us to be able to understand not only documents that come out of China, but also speeches from key figures, for example, and other sources. And we had a similar service, as you mentioned, until the late 1990s. And I think that in the 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a period there where we really thought that the United States would only be the only great superpower from there ever after, the only country that was going to maintain that role in the world. And now what you have is a very aggressive and resurgent China, and also resurgent Russia. And so there's a usefulness now to have OTAC.
Mm-hmm. It seems like a strong premise, and it seems like a smart premise, is that breaking down language barriers can lead us to better understand China's goals. I'm wondering if this is enacted and it passes into law and the translation service and center gets erected and stood up, do you think we would then develop a more ominous understanding of China's goals or a more benign outlook? What do you think that by this greater understanding, what do you think the takeaways would be of the China that we see, that we live in today, that we live with today? We're not in China.
You broke up a little bit during that question, but this doesn't necessarily have to be something that inflames tensions towards China. As you know, there's already in the United States and in the United States Congress also how to compete with China, define when they cheat and so forth. So this could also be a way to achieve greater understanding and understand their perspective. And again, there are challenges that as Americans and those of us in Congress that we face. For example, I don't believe we've clearly defined when it is that we should compete with China and when they're fairly competing with the United States and other nations, when they are cheating and when we need to call them out on it. And then finally, when we ought to cooperate with them on certain issues like climate change or security in different regions of the world.
Mm-hmm. This is no small feat getting bipartisan legislation that is happening related to your center. It was introduced alongside Republican Mike Gallagher, and you both of you have spent time talking about China and what the challenge that it represents, but you've talked about it in very different ways, and you've characterized the challenge in very different ways. I mean, he has said that China is a genocidal communist regime that now threatens our cities. That was a remark from just yesterday, I believe, following the hypersonic missile reports that came out. Why do you think that you've made a compelling case for why this translation center should exist? Why do you think your Republican colleagues also like the idea of it? Are we having a technical issue right now?
There you go.
Sorry, I'm not sure exactly what happened. Did you catch the question, Congressman?
I missed your third question there.
I'm sorry about that. I was saying just that you made a pretty compelling case for why you think that this needs to exist, this open translation center. Why do you think your Republican colleagues support it?
I think there's concern all around. There's concern about what our posture as a nation and as a Congress will be towards China in the coming years. And you're right. Look, if you look around Congress, there's people whose posture is very aggressive and very hawkish and wants to punish China for everything they can imagine. There are people that take a more measured approach and want to see where we can cooperate and collaborate. But the fundamental basis for any of that, I think we should all be able to agree, is understanding what China is actually saying and what they're doing. So this isn't just the equivalent of a Google Translate. If that was the case, we would just leave it to automation. There's also a component here that involves analysis, analyzing, for example, if there's a speech given by different Chinese leaders, understanding the significance of who the speakers are and whether they're close, or that a particular person is close to Xi Jinping, for example. So understanding where their perspective fits in within the Chinese government. So it's translation, of course, but that second part is very important. It's also analysis.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I do wonder when it comes to communication and having sort of the best understanding of what's happening between our two countries. I do wonder what your view is on the fact that now China has more diplomats around the world than any other country. It's also happening when we have vacancies in key positions. Ambassador to South Korea and ambassador for France remain unfilled, and some have said that a side effect of this is already having miscommunications on issues like AUKUS, which enraged the French after the nuclear submarine deal was announced between the United States, Britain, and Australia. Do you think that the United States has failed to prioritize its diplomatic corps in a meaningful way? You obviously have spent a lot of time on oversight of the State Department, and that's also a key way of communication and understanding what's going on from the United States into China in an elite level.
Well, over the generations, our focus as a nation has been on building up our military to make sure that it's the most superior military to any in the world. And the United States so far has been successful in that. But our military, the Department of Defense, is roughly 30 times the size of the State Department. And so the State Department and diplomacy are essentially the relationship building part of how we deal with other nations. Military represents hopefully a deterrent, but also, if necessary, obviously, a coercive force. And so you want that to be your last resort or your last option. Unfortunately, we haven't always prioritized or built up the infrastructure for diplomacy that would allow us to make sure that we're reducing the tensions, that we're building up alliances around the world, to make sure that we're in the strongest position in terms of allies and support. And it's interesting, you mentioned the number of diplomats that China has. There right now is this imbalance between the United States military positions around the world. So, for example, China only has one military base outside of mainland China, and that's in Djibouti. Now, they're working very hard to try to place military bases in other continents around the world, but the United States obviously is far ahead of China in that respect. Still, they have done a lot of work under their Belt and Road Initiative to expand their alliances around the world, whether it's in Africa or Latin America or Europe, just everywhere, and they're doing it very quickly.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. When it comes to the diplomacy and who's winning sort of the game of influence between sort of the United States and China, China has distributed 1.1 billion vaccines. That's according to its own data anyway. And the United States has delivered about 190 million vaccines. The Chinese vaccine may not be as effective, probably isn't as effective as US vaccines. But how do you think the United States has fared when compared to China, when it specifically relates to sort of vaccine diplomacy coming out of this coronavirus pandemic?
Well, I've been among the members of Congress who have argued that we should do more for the world. Obviously, we need to make sure we take care of Americans, that in this case, we get people, the remaining folks, fully vaccinated and also get boosters in people's arms, but also that we step up our efforts around the world. And you're right, China has practiced from the beginning this vaccine diplomacy and has tried to leverage the gifting and sometimes even the sale of their vaccines to gain concessions in other areas, whether it's military, economic, or so forth. And so, the United States needs to step up our efforts there. Now, there are, just from different things that I've been briefed on in the Intelligence Committee, for example, nations that do feel burned by the way that China has approached this vaccine diplomacy. So it's not like it's been 100% rosy for them in how they've gone about it. And people do appreciate the United States efforts. Still, you mentioned that big differential, and it's something that we ought to close the gap on.
Mm-hmm. Congressman, you have been a voice that some have described as a progressive voice on foreign policy, and someone who looks at U.S. foreign policy in sort of a new way, sort of breaking out of old thinking. And obviously, there's a lot of thought that's been put into how we have started to depart from a sort of post 9/11 counterterrorism posture with our foreign policy. A lot of soul searching happening after Afghanistan as well, that the United States has spent trillions and trillions of dollars on its counterterrorism wars, efforts to nation build in other parts of the world. And there's obviously a lot of fatigue in the United States about that. But I think there's also concern that one of the ways that the United States might pivot in foreign policy is towards a sort of existential civilizational struggle with China that could make the costs of the war on terror look small by comparison, given all of the new bells, whistles, and toys that are being proposed, including out of Congress, in terms of new capabilities that'll be required to confront China, and if we don't, an authoritarian sort of new curtain will sort of drape itself over the world. Are you concerned at all that there could be that this push could result in even more sort of unaccountable, far-flung spending at the Pentagon, where a lot of the domestic agenda that Democrats support could fall by the wayside as a result?
At this point, that's certainly possible. And I would argue that to a great extent, even how we spend our military dollars now, I don't believe is completely in step with the challenges that China poses militarily. We still spend a lot of money on what would be considered traditional or mainline military weaponry, tanks, airplanes, ships, and so forth. And don't get me wrong, I understand those are necessary, but China is engaging on a whole other front that to me is even more problematic and more troublesome. And that's the technology front, whether it's quantum computing, artificial intelligence, for example, other innovative technologies that if they're able to break through, the threat to the United States is such that even your best weaponry, your most sophisticated weaponry of today could be rendered useless literally in a matter of seconds or minutes. And so to me, we need to be spending our money wiser, and wiser means that we're beefing up our cybersecurity, that we're improving our cyber alliances around the world, that we're being innovative in the fields that I mentioned in a way that protects the national security of the United States and of our allies. And right now, in terms of how we spend our military dollars, I haven't seen a strong enough pivot in that direction. I'm not saying that it's not going on at all. In fact, some of that has increased in the budget over the years, but I don't think that it's been as aggressive as it should be in making that pivot.
And I understand what you mean about where you spend defense dollars. Do you think that we should keep the spending at the same levels and just spend it on new things, or do you think spending should go down?
Well, I actually think that if we spent it what I would consider more appropriately for the times, I actually think that it should be cheaper, that the things that we should be investing a lot of money in right now are actually cheaper than the things that have cost us more traditionally. And also, I think we have to understand sometimes there is this disconnect between politics and good policy. And before I give this example, I don't want to stand here and say that I have not gone down this road either. I think that if you looked at my 8 years in Congress, I probably have a time or two. But military dollars and military spending cannot be first and foremost considered a jobs program. As important as it is that the military is a huge employer in different people's districts, that's incredibly important, and it's a great benefit to the community. But it's not mostly meant to be a jobs program. It's meant to be a national security program. And sometimes we've lost sight of that in Congress.
Mm-hmm. One question on spending that I just wanted to bring up is that, looking at this, it looks like its current iteration of the bill that you introduced, if it's just Russia focused, it would be about $80 million a year. You mentioned, this is more than just Google Translate, but many of us have used Google Translate when it comes to trying to read articles coming out of China. What does $80 million get you beyond the Google Translate in terms of the benefits of this service?
Well, of course, there's a translation that will be from folks who are familiar with the slogans, the particular sayings, for example, in China. So more accurate than a rough Google Translate. But also the analysis part is also very valuable. And right now, we mentioned, of course, China and Russia, but there is the potential to expand it beyond those nations as well. So the analysis part is especially important, and important not just for people in government. So it's not just a benefit to the State Department or the Department of Defense and so forth, the administration, but also to the media, for example. And I believe it was Radio Free Asia, for example, that translated documents, procurement contracts, and they were the ones that broke the story on the Uyghur internment camps. And so there's a real role for this kind of translation and analysis in the work that government does, but also the work that media does.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I wonder, as we, I appreciate you highlighting the Uyghur issue as well. And obviously this is becoming more and more important and talked about as we learn more about what is happening in China. Another thing that is on the agenda, right, is the Olympics and this decision of what to do. A full boycott, a diplomatic boycott, letting U.S. athletes compete and seeing what where the chips fall. When you've thought about the Olympics, what do you think the United States? How do you think it should approach the issue in China for next year?
Well, I chair on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I chair the subcommittee on international development, international organizations, and global corporate social impact. So I convened a meeting with the U.S. Olympic Committee and the International Olympic Committee not too long ago, maybe about 5 weeks ago, and asked them some of these questions about the upcoming Olympics, and specifically, being mindful of the fact that we strongly disagree with the human rights issue on the treatment of Uyghurs in China, and making sure that the Olympic Committee doesn't do anything to uplift or inadvertently promote any of what's going on there. And that in the future, for future bids, for example, that you start to set certain guidelines on things like human rights and other issues for the bidders, for the nations that are bidding, so that we don't get into situations where nations are being perceived as being rewarded, even though they're committing egregious behavior, human rights behavior.
Congressman, do you care about climate change? President Biden cares about climate change. It's pretty clear that some of the biggest problems when it comes to climate change are China's domestic coal use. And so that's why the U.S. administration, especially Special Envoy Kerry, has said that it is so critical to cooperate with China or get on the same page with China when it comes to solving the problem of climate change. The Chinese, at the same time, have said, listen, you cannot isolate climate cooperation. We have a very bad bilateral relationship with China. And until that bilateral relationship improves, we're not going to have a successful cooperation on climate. Given these problems, given that dynamic, how does the United States get to a place of climate cooperation with China, given all that's going on?
Well, a few things. You're right about the challenges that China poses in terms of its own development of energy. But China is also one of the leaders in the world in developing alternative energies and clean energies. So they have a very strong economic interest in promoting that energy around the world, and then I believe ultimately in moving there themselves. And we've seen some of that. And so I think that provides an opening. Also in working through multilateral institutions, not just in a bilateral way, but through multilateral institutions and multilateral agreements like the Paris Climate Accord to get us all moving in the same direction. I'm not under any illusion that it's going to be easy or simple or that it's going to be solved in just a matter of a few years, but it's absolutely essential given the threats of climate change. Another issue that I think that we ought to work on together is the issue of climate refugees, for example. There's been no international or even American standard set for what a climate refugee is. And that's one area where I believe that China and the United States, with other nations in the world, can work together to acknowledge that people migrate because of climate events and that they should be offered protection in the way that we offer protection to people who suffer from political persecution.
Do you believe that the United States can, on a daily basis or weekly basis or monthly basis, condemn in strong terms like genocide when talking about China, condemn it on human rights, condemn it on Hong Kong, and condemn it on Taiwan, and all of the other issues we disagree with China, and still have a productive relationship with the Chinese when it comes to climate?
Well, I think that it's essential. You're talking about the top two economies in the world. You're talking about two countries that, at least historically, have had the highest levels of emissions. And so we've got to be able to cooperate on an issue like that concerns not only our own nations, but the world. But you're right, John. I mean, look, it's a very thorny relationship. And the Congress, I feel, and the United States government has not fully defined each of those categories that I mentioned, what it means for them to cheat, what it means for them to fairly compete, and then the areas that we can cooperate in. I feel like we're getting closer, but I still don't feel like we're fully there.
Do you think that in some cases the United States might have to modulate its rhetoric in some ways and soften it? Or is this an issue where standing up on human rights, where we do have such strong differences with the Chinese, is an absolute, and any sort of wavering would be a disappointment and fall short of our values as a country?
I think we have to lead with our values. There are certain things that this country stands for: freedom, democracy, and protecting human rights. And so we shouldn't waver in terms of those values and principles. Now, when we negotiate with China and we have conversations with them, then obviously we try to do what it takes to get them to move in the humane direction. But in terms of our public posture and standing up for our values to the world, we need to do that.
The Pentagon recently unveiled this notion that the right way to frame the U.S.-China relationship is strategic competition. Do you think that's the right framework? And if it is, what do you think winning looks like?
That's a great question. I mean, I guess let me just think through it. Obviously you're dealing with the world's two largest economies. It's a relationship that is thorny and fraught with ironies, because we're very harsh competitors in many arenas, but they're our largest trading partner. I mean, China is our largest trading partner, and I reminded in the committee a few of my members across the aisle who have berated China on certain things, on the fact that it's a communist country, for example. It is a communist country, but you're also lauding all of the economic trade that the United States does with China. So there's a lot of ironies there. I mean, ultimately, I think that what China is trying to sell is not only its goods and services around the world. It's not just a matter of Huawei or other companies going and competing with US or European telecom companies. They're also trying to sell their goodwill and their form of government, their authoritarianism. And part of the way they do that is not just by saying, hey, our way is great, you ought to adopt it instead of being democratic. I don't think that's exactly how it happens at all. Part of the way that it happens is through economic alliances and development alliances. Such that, for example, taking money, if you're a country perhaps in Africa or Latin America or in Southeast Asia, taking assistance or money from China often comes with no strings attached. That means they tend to look the other way if a dictatorial leader in a nation is mistreating his or her people. There are just no strings attached. We're not going to call you out on that. We're not going to sanction you financially, for example, on those things. Whereas with the United States, as I mentioned, because we're promoting our values of democracy, freedom, and human rights, when we engage with nations, we often expect them to uphold certain values consistent with our own values. And so what China is saying is, hey, we're not asking anything of you, or maybe perfunctorily we are, but we're really not going to enforce that. And so that's the competition that you face in dealing with China, that is state capitalist, but also is spending a lot of money in building up friends around the world.
Well, Congressman, I appreciate that those answers, and I'm going to hand it over to Ode for the Q&As to get the rest in. The last thing I just wanted to ask you about is how the administration has reacted to your legislation, and what the prospects are for passage at this point.
Well, we're working really hard on it, and we're working with folks in the Senate to get it filed over there. It's a bipartisan bill, which in this environment in Congress is good, because it's hard if things aren't bipartisan to often get them across the finish line. But no, the response from the administration, I think, has been very positive. We've reached out for guidance to different folks in the administration on how they would do something or other within the legislation. And so I'm very hopeful, all in all.
Representative Castro John, thank you very much for this very insightful conversation. My name is O'Donnell, and I'm an Associate Director with NAI. Now we're going to turn to questions from the audience to continue the discussion. To our listeners, please do submit your questions in the Q&A option in your Zoom window. So first, I would like to go back to existing initiatives that we mentioned earlier. We have this very interesting question from Brooke Hefrai, who asked, the Translation Center sounds like a great idea, but FBIS didn't go away. It became the Open Source Center, then the Open Source Enterprise, first under ODNI, then under CIA. It continues to exist and produce reporting. However, CIA no longer makes those products public or share it with much of the US government. So how will OTAC complement and not duplicate this? And if I can just follow on with a question from Vivian Walker along the same lines, there are already multiple resources within the State Department's public diplomacy operations to include the geographic bureaus, like the Global Engagement Center and the Global Public Affairs Bureau, that provide content analysis, translation, and distribution. So to what degree would the Translation Center build from or coordinate with those efforts?
Oh, that's a great question. And you're right. FBIS never fully went away, and it morphed into the open source program. But as you mentioned, that's oftentimes producing classified information that isn't readily available in the way that the information coming out of OTAC would be. And so this would be an attempt to make it much more accessible to people in government, but also the American public, including people in the media, in American media, and to our allies around the world. And also in doing that, including analysis that would be very helpful to all of those different groups in understanding China and being able to get a perspective on China in a way that I think they wouldn't otherwise be able to.
Thank you. And coming back to the funding issue, so as we know, there is already an underfunding problem within states and public diplomacy. So will the estimated 80 to 85 million appropriation to offset the Translation Center costs come from the existing appropriation for public diplomacy operations in the State Department?
My hope is that it would be separately funded. My idea is not to necessarily cannibalize anything else. Although I do want to get the recommendation of folks as we go through this process at the State Department on exactly how we do this. But my idea, the legislation, was not to go cannibalize something, but to make sure that we have this standalone center that would be able to provide this valuable resource.
Mm-hmm. So I will come back to the budget issue, but I'd like to widen the discussion a bit to talk about diversity, which is something that you advocate for. Why do you think that is important, having more diversity within State Department, and what would a more diverse diplomatic corps look like? How would it be different, and what would it take to actually achieve diversity?
Well, it's actually been very difficult over the years. I just want to we could speak about the federal government in general, but let's speak about the State Department, for example, and our diplomatic corps. The State Department still doesn't fully reflect the diversity of the nation. And I think our diplomatic corps in particular, and our civil service, should reflect our nation's diversity. When diplomats from around the world, when others from around the world see an ambassador representing the United States or somebody at a U.S. consulate, they ought to see the face of America. And it's not just a matter of having people from different backgrounds or different skin tones. It's important because we're all part of American society, contribute to American culture and so forth. And it's important that people see that in the folks that are representing this country. But also there's a very valuable impact that a diverse group of people working together can bring to their work. And unfortunately, that's been missing over the years. And so when I took over as subcommittee chair last term, the first thing that I did was convene the different affinity groups at the State Department and ask them how we get a more diverse State Department. So we spoke about getting better at recruiting diverse candidates, at retention, because you have a lot of folks that come in the door but don't end up staying for 15 or 20 years. They leave. So how you recruit better, how you retain better, and then how you do a better job of promoting folks as well. And it's imperative that the State Department get this right because there's a real value to our country.
Mhm. And what just coming back to something that John briefly brought up earlier about the blocking of ambassadors within the Senate. So I would be curious to know what you think about that issue. There is a real tension between congressional oversight of foreign policy and the ability of individual senators to act as a complete bloc. So what's your take on this issue?
Well, first, not just on this issue of blocking ambassadors, but on other issues, I don't believe that every individual United States senator should have the power that they do to block different appointments and put a blue slip or whatever it may be to block those appointments. I think it's giving too much power to a single individual. Now, I know that it's an old custom and a tradition and so forth, and perhaps some compromise would be that if it's a group of 5 or some other number that it may be. But right now, what it's doing is it's clogging up the system. It's depriving the Biden administration of important appointments, allies around the world who can make sure that the infrastructure for diplomacy is in place and that we're dealing with all of these very challenging issues, whether it was the withdrawal from Afghanistan and now the aftermath of that, the relationship with China, re-engaging after the Trump years, which I see as years of disengagement, re-engaging with Europe and NATO, making sure that we're strengthening our efforts in Latin America. All of those things require personnel. They require ambassadors and other personnel. And to the extent you have a senator like Ted Cruz from Texas, who is denying one senator, denying the administration and the country, it's not just a political thing, denying the country of key appointments, key personnel in place to deal with these national security issues. It's dangerous. I consider that dangerous. He's playing a very dangerous game with our national security.
And so, we alluded to the question of the relation between State Department and Congress. And so could you tell us more about what the relationship between the State Department and Congress is right now? And would you like to see any changes with how state communicates with Congress and vice versa? So I think we have some technical problems. We're going to wait just for a couple of seconds. I think there is some internet issue on Representative Castro's side. Please hold on just a few seconds with us.
Sorry,
Yes.
I lost you there for a second. But you
Yes.
asked about the relationship between the State Department and Congress?
Exactly. And if any changes, what would you like, what changes would you like to see in the way states communicate with Congress and vice versa?
That's a great question. The Secretary Blinken has made himself available a few times now to Congress. The department, I think, has made an effort to be especially cooperative with the Congress during this term. Again, consider my bias, but I thought that the previous 4 years, the department was in a very defensive mode. You had, in many ways, a mass exodus of people, many senior diplomats included, who left the department. And so it was always, seemed to me, from my perspective on the committee, in some kind of turmoil or another. And so this has been very much kind of a rebuilding process for them and an assessment of where we are, America's standing in the world now, because I do think that it took a hit in the previous administration. And so far, they've been fairly cooperative, I think, with Congress. But we do need to work on some key components. And that's why many of us have done work in the last few years on reimagining the State Department. What does the State Department look like for the next 10, 20 years? And so forth. So to answer your question, what I hope they would work with us on is making sure that it's not just reimagining the department, but we start taking affirmative steps to rework the department. Diversity is one of the issues, but doing a better job in terms of retaining people, in allowing folks who are in mid-career to also join the State Department, not because we want to allow outside people to automatically leapfrog any of the very well qualified candidates at the State Department, but I think you have to allow some way for folks to come in who didn't necessarily start there at the beginning. So different ways that we can reorganize the State Department to make sure that it is completely modernized for the times that we're in.
Yes, thank you. And I think that, that's very important. And I think you've been an advocate for elevating diplomacy as a tool of US foreign policy. So how would we go about doing that? Are there any specific areas within the US government that need reform? And what opportunities are there for those in the private sector to help boost US peaceful engagement around the world?
Oh, there's incredible opportunities. In fact, just the other day, we did a whole conversation on state and local diplomacy, and the fact that one of the things that we can do as a federal government and the State Department is to engage state and local efforts at a subnational diplomacy. If you think about it, through the Sister Cities organization and other organizations, there's an incredible infrastructure of subnational diplomacy that goes on in our country every single day. And we have to be able to tap into that in a much better way. And then there are other ways, for example, engaging American companies in USAID's efforts and other efforts in terms of development work and how we marshal the best and the brightest ideas from the private sector in taking on the world's development challenges. I was a big champion and supporter of what was called a Global Development Lab, operated a few years ago and then disbanded under the Trump administration, or at least broken up into different pieces within the State Department. But one of the things that it did successfully was to put a call out to private companies, for example, nonprofits, others, to take on some of the world's greatest development challenges, figure them out, and then help scale them up. And so those are some of the ways that we can engage our private sector, who can be very helpful on diplomacy and on development.
Thank you. And maybe just one last quick question, because we need to wrap up. And coming back to the unfunding, the underfunding issue, but also the discrepancy between military spending over diplomacy. So can those funds be rebalanced at all? You've alluded to the question earlier, but if you had one final word, what do you think it will take for meaningful change in spending or priorities to take place?
You know, I can tell you what I hope that it doesn't take, or what doesn't happen, I should say. You know, we saw this this nuclear test that China just accomplished, and you know, the system that they were essentially testing. And what I hope that we don't experience is some kind of great cyber intrusion. We already had the issue of Russia messing with our 2016 elections, but some greater attack on our critical infrastructure that's truly crippling for the country. And you know, I fear that that will end up really waking people up and waking politicians up to the fact that we need to spend our money differently. We need to protect the integrity of our systems. It's not just about buying new armaments. It's about putting a technological infrastructure in place to protect your networks and protect your systems, and build alliances to do the same thing, because other nations are vulnerable as well. And we need to be able to harness our collective resources. And my fear is that if we don't do that, then we're going to be left very vulnerable to a rapidly advancing, technologically advancing China. And that would put us in a very vulnerable position. So that's what I don't want to see happen, is that we're kind of woken up by some, you know, huge, devastating attack on our critical infrastructure that's crippling, and all of a sudden now, you know, everybody's discovered the importance of focusing on this other piece.
Thank you, Representative Castro, and I do hope that we will not get to that point. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but thanks again, Representative Castro, for being here with us. Thank you to the audience for submitting your questions. I'm now going to turn it over to Emma, who will offer some concluding remarks. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Well, that was a great conversation, and a really wide-ranging one. I think, you know, the impression I take away is that it's really imperative that the United States rebuilds its diplomatic capacity as we go forward into the 21st century. And I think this conversation really helps us understand some of the ways we might do that and some of the obstacles we might face. So I'd like to thank Representative Castro and John and Ode and all of you for joining us today. Before we conclude, I'd just like to highlight one great opportunity for any students who might be on the call. New American Engagement Initiative is running a student competition looking for the best new idea in foreign policy. The winning team of students will take home a cash prize and the opportunity to turn your idea into an Atlantic Council publication. So if you're interested, the link is in the chat and you can check out our website for more details. Thanks again to everyone for joining us, and I hope you all have a great evening.